So one of the things that's cool about the Impala SS, they made them from 94 to 96. There's a couple of variations. The later ones had bucket seats. The earlier ones were bench seat only. They had upgraded police car suspension, so it's got bigger sway bars. It's got higher spring rate springs. So they were a pretty darn good car from the factory, but we're gonna make it better with our coilover kit. I'm going to do an installation here on this 96 Impala SS. It's a very simple installation. On the front, all we have to do is drill out the lower shock mounts on the control arm, and then in the rear for the lower bracket, we're going to have to drill a hole for the supplied bolt for the upper tab. It uses the original lower shock mount to mount. It's pretty simple to install. Follow along and see how I do it. Before you start, you want to measure the ride height, and as you can see, this car doesn't sit square. It's off by 3/4 of an inch in the front, and it's off by 3/8 of an inch in the rear. As you can tell, what I did is I took the caliper off and hung it off of my little hook. There's also an anti-lock sensor that goes to the back side of the disc brake. I disconnect the connector that's up by the frame, and then I pop it out of the couple of little brackets that holds that sensor wire in place. And then there's the one that has the 13mm headed bolt that you have to unscrew from the frame, and then you can take the whole front spindle off. I like to take the entire front brake assembly off and set it aside because it makes it a lot easier to install the coilover, but we can also get better camera angles. You can do the coilover installation and not disconnect the upper ball joint or the tie rod end just by dropping everything out the bottom from the lower A-arm, but I just find it easier to take the brakes off and work with it that way. So on the top of most OEM shocks, they have the two flats, also referred to as a double D. I actually have a few of the double D sockets, but unfortunately I keep forgetting to bring them down here to use them. Normally, if you take and put a pair of vice grips on the two flats and then loosen the lock nut up, it'll come apart real easy. A lot of times I'll find that if I loosen the nuts on the lower control arm bushings, it makes it easier to work with and get the coilover shock in. And if it's a rubber bushing, we definitely want to retorque the bolts down after all of the weight is on the ground. We've taken our suspension apart in the front, and now I want to show you what we're going to be installing on our Impala SS. I've got a combination of a single adjustable and a double adjustable, just stuff laid out so that you can see how the kit is. The difference between the single adjustable and the double adjustable kit is you can separate the rebound and compression adjustment. So on the front shock, you can see there's a knob on the top and a knob on the bottom. So the bottom is compression, the knob on the top is rebound. So there's 20 points of adjustment range with the rebound, and there's 6 points of compression adjustment. On the rear, I've got the single adjustable shock, so it only has the rebound knob on the top. This style knob has 11 points of adjustment. If it was a double adjustable, there would also be a compression knob on the bottom like this one does. But like I said, I've just laid some stuff out so that I can show you how everything works. So this kit is going to allow you to adjust your ride height. The adjustment range is from about stock ride height in the front to about a 2-inch drop. The rear is going to be about stock ride height to a 3-inch drop. And I always use the term about. These cars are now 25, 30 years old. So what you're seeing now is not necessarily how the car was built from the factory when it was new. Now that we've talked about all of this stuff that we're going to install in our Impala, follow along and see how we do it. The lower shock bolt hole needs to be drilled out to 3/8 of an inch because we're using 3/8 hardware now. Two things I like to do when I start to assemble is I'm going to put some grease on my thrust bearing. So the thrust bearing is a bearing steel, so it's not plated, so it will rust. And so what I like to do is put a little bit of grease on it. And the grease is also going to, help it for reducing the friction. And I just kind of do a wipe of grease, kind of fill between all the little rollers. And then I put my upper race on. And that's all you really need. So on my shock, what I'm going to do is I'm going to run the spring seat all the way down as close to the bottom as possible. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to put just a little additional copper-based anti-seize. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to drop my greased thrust bearings onto my spring seat. Before we assemble it, what I'm going to do is I'm going to unscrew my rebound adjustment knob, So the set screws here, you do not want to take the set screws out. The set screws hold the knob together. It does not hold the knob to the shock itself. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to put my spring on top of the spring seat, and then I'm going to install it in the car. Okay, so what I do is I screw my nut down to make sure that the bushing and the nipple is inside the hole of the frame and centered correctly. I want the shock to be loose enough that I can move it around so we can line the bolt holes up to the lower control arm. So included with the hardware kit is going to be the small diameter washer. So what I want to do is put the small diameter washer on the top side of the T-bar, and that way with the small diameter washer it allows more movement for misalignment and to be able to get everything aligned and in the holes correctly. So when we're tightening the upper bushings down, what I like to do is tighten the first nut down, and a lot of times what you can do is feel the bushing start to expand and get a little bulge to it, and that's usually right where you want to be for tightening it. You don't want to run the nut and bottom it on the threads. And a good indication that it's correct is when you put the jam nut on it, there's about 2 to 3 threads above the nut, and that's a very good indication that these upper bushings are tightened correctly. On the double adjustable stem style shock, what I like to do is put just a little bit of red grease inside where the brass is going to go and a little bit on the outside, so that when you go and tighten everything down and screw the adjuster in place, it has just a little bit of grease for the ball detent. But also what it'll do is it'll help keep any moisture or anything out of the shaft of the shock, because it'll have that little bit of grease. And what I do is I tighten the adjuster all the way till it stops, and then I back it off 10 clicks. And so at that point, this adjuster is now in the middle of its travel for the rebound. So now you can go 10 clicks more firm or 10 clicks softer. I just installed everything on the front. We're going to go to the back and let me show you how to do the back. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to jack this side up. So what this will do is it'll move the axle up, and it's going to move the opposite side down, and that way I can get the spring out easier because there's so much preload on the factory spring. So this car had, which is actually pretty cool, but this is an aftermarket piece that's been made, and so it's a U-bolt because the upper bolts are so difficult to get to. This car had them on it and made it a lot easier to disassemble and take the rear shocks off. I tightened my upper bracket down. I'm going to start my hole on this upper mount. And what I'm doing with my 1/2-inch drill is I'm using my bracket as the drill guide, and then after I get a good mark and a good location, then what I'm going to do is get an 1/8-inch drill bit. I'm going to drill a pilot hole, and then I'm going to go from the back side and drill the hole. In this kit, you'll notice there's a few different variations of spacers. So on the lower side, you'll notice there's a stepped style spacer. There's a real fat one and a real thin one. The real thin one goes to the rear of the car. The fat one goes to the front of the car. We're pushing the shock a little bit away from the axle housing, so there's plenty of clearance for the spring to the axle housing. The other spacers are a tapered style spacer. So these are going to go on the upper, and they're both the same size. We've installed our rear coilover kit. As you can see, it's pretty simple to drill the 2 holes per side that needs to be done. The 1/2-inch bolts are going to be torqued to 75 foot-pounds. The upper bolt hole that I drilled and I put a 3/8 hole in it, that's going to be 35 foot-pounds because it's a 3/8 bolt. For more information about the installation on this Impala SS or any other questions you have about Aldan American products, check us out at aldanamerican.com.